Okay, so here we have the skeleton of a horse, and we want to name the parts of the skeleton. So we'll start out with the general skeleton itself, from front to back, through the spinal column. So the head, the neck, the spinal column, all the way to the tail. So that's all of the vertebrae. We call that the axial skeleton. And then the parts that hang off the axial skeleton, so the ribs will be included as part of the axial skeleton. Then the parts that hang off that, the limbs, we call the appendicular skeleton. And then we can further divide that into the forelimbs and the hind limbs, and we give them the name of thoracic limbs for the forelimbs and pelvic limbs for the hind limbs. So the forelimbs are called the thoracic limbs because they support the thorax or the trunk of the horse, and the pelvic limbs are called the pelvic limbs because they connect to the axial skeleton through the pelvis. So now we have the axial skeleton, which is made up of the head, the neck, the rest of the spinal column, and the ribs. That's the axial skeleton. And then all four limbs can be described as the appendicular skeleton because they're appendages that hang off the long axis or axial skeleton. And then we can divide the appendicular skeleton, the limbs, into the forward pair or the front pair. That's the thoracic limbs. And the hind pair are called the pelvic limbs. So we have axial, appendicular, thoracic, pelvic. So the appendicular is made up of the thoracic and the pelvic. But if we want to be more precise and just speak about the front pair, we could call them the thoracic pair. If we wanted to speak about the hind pair, we could call them the pelvic pair. So now let's go back to the axial skeleton and separate it into individual parts. So it's all made up of the head, the vertebrae, which then connect from the head, form the spine all the way to the tip of the tail. And the ribs come off some of these vertebrae. So there are individual parts that interlock. And some of them are fixed together to form one piece in the mature horse, but the majority of them articulate with each other, especially in the horse's neck, not so much in the rest of the horse's spine or back. So we'll start out with the first group, which are called the cervical vertebrae, and there are 7 of those. So we've got 7 cervical vertebrae, and then the next group are called the thoracic group of vertebrae, and we have 18 of those. So those are thoracic vertebrae, not thoracic limbs, because they're vertebrae that make up the spinal column. And there are 18 of those, and it's off those that the ribs are connected to then the sternum, which is the bottom part of most of the forward ribs, giving us the rib cage that protects the internal organs. Then right behind the thoracic vertebra, we have the lumbar. And there are 6 lumbar vertebrae. So that's the part of the horse's spine that will be just right behind the saddle. So in front of the hind limb, but behind the saddle. So 6 lumbar, and then behind that we have the sacral. And we have 5 sacral vertebrae. And in a mature horse, they will form one bone that then articulates with the pelvis. And then behind the sacral vertebra, we have the last group of vertebra, which are the coccygeal. And we will have about 18 of those. So this is all the axial skeleton. We have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. Now, as I've heard here, it's not absolutely necessary for you to know all of these names for the axial skeleton, but you should be knowledgeable about being able to divide the skeleton into the axial and the appendicular, and then what does the thoracic limb mean and what does the pelvic limb mean. If you know these other names of the axial skeleton, that's great, but it's not an absolute necessity. So the next thing we're going to do is then look at an individual thoracic limb to start and name the parts of that.